Hi, this is my individual oral where I've chosen the global issue of beliefs, values, and education. Um, I've narrowed the focus of that a little bit, and I'm not 100% happy with it, but I've come up with the idea of representations of childhood oppressed by authoritarian paradigms. And we're going to be looking at how children are represented into specific pieces, and then also how these authoritarian paradigms are represented as well. So the two pieces that I've chosen to look at is The Garden of Love by William Blake, which was published in the late 1700s, and a beautiful poem. And then the non-literary text I've chosen is Changing Education Paradigms by Sir Ken Robinson. So the first text that we're looking here is Sir Ken Robinson's Changing Education Paradigms. This was his follow-up presentation to his infamous speech, Do Schools Kill Creativity, which is one of the most, actually in fact, the most viewed TED Talk, and has been so for a very long time. He positions himself as an educationalist, or calls himself an educationalist, and he has a specific focus on the arts and creativity. He's characterized as a provocateur or a change agent for education and also within education. So he doesn't sit on the sidelines and critique it from an outside point of view. He's within it, and this is represented in the way that he speaks with language as well. He also adopts an anti-neoliberal posture. So rather than looking at the individual circumstances of students and the outcomes, their outcomes, he looks at the broader social influences and the institutional influences on their outcomes. This piece is a multimodal piece. So it's made up of the speech itself, which was performed and then recorded. It's made up of the animation by Andrew Park, and then those things are pulled together and edited by Becca Pine, who then released that on for the RSA on the YouTube channel. Because of this, I'm going to be trying to be mindful of the fact that there are multiple different attitudes and arguments represented in these different aspects of the piece itself. And then one of those different representations is the way that Sir Ken Robinson's ethos is developed here. He is actually part of the education paradigm, but he's positioning himself as the next thing, and this is the way that he's represented in Park's illustrations here. You can see the box, the box-like structure of his face, and then the fact that he's climbing up out of that, representing him moving beyond the paradigm. You can see the aggressive posture and gesturing of Robinson's depiction over here, and you can see the thinking pose here, the allusion to that famous sculpture, and then all the different emanata that comes out of his particular way of thinking through here. It talks about and the represented symbols related to emotion as well as creativity and thinking. And this is the way that his ethos or his credibility or his characterization is depicted through the illustrations of Park. The first depiction of childhood is seen here in one of the first arguments that he makes, which is a contextual argument. The depiction of childhood is seen as these cardboard cutouts represented on a graph, looking at the way that children are framed within the cultural context of an economic or economic demands placed upon them in a capitalist society. The other fascinating thing that continues and recurs in Robinson's speech is this representation of himself as we. He places himself within the educational paradigm, not just sitting outside and commenting within it, which engenders a very affirming view of teachers who are inclined to adopt his point of view. What's really interesting about this representation of the paradigms, and these particular figures here are meant to represent key figures within the Industrial Revolution. Talk about intellectual culture of enlightenment, Cultural Revolution over here. They are not particularly negative, and so they're almost esteemed. And so when Robinson discusses these particular figures, he's not overly critical of the people involved in establishing the paradigm of the Industrial Revolution. And what he wants to do more is look at the residue of that revolution on our current practice in teaching practice. So these representations aren't necessarily overly critical. The next representation of children is in this, the use of costumes here to represent the different cultural identities. And so while he doesn't depict children as being this homogenous group, he does recognize that there are different cultural identities and different cultural reflections of what it means to be human, and that this is actually important in understanding human beings and also understanding human nature in talking about that conditioned view. So this is where we see the most important and fundamental argument about children from Robinson, where he represents this idea that basically creativity and what is beautiful and precious about children is squashed and repressed by the current education paradigm, or what shouldn't be the current education paradigm. We can see that representation in the shedding of a costume here and the joyful face, and how that face is spurting forth music representing creativity. And this is representative of the redemptive attitude that he has towards children, that just because the current system does this doesn't mean it can't be redeemed. It doesn't mean that we can't move it back and redeem children, and possibly even redeem ourselves from that repressive regime. You can see that here in terms of the capacity for creativity represented here as well. The children become less and less happy as they grow older, and they become less and less creative. And that's represented in the physicality here, and that's represented in his argument about returning to a more natural state and a state of greater flourishing. This is where we move towards the next representation of children as subject to this regime. Specifically, this argument looks at the medical treatment of particular techniques used to placate children and dull creativity. What's really interesting about this is the pathos of this moment, and there's a confluence between the pathos of Robinson's speaking style and the pathos of the representations of children. So the same figure here, who has saliva dripping down his face here. We've got the tongue dripping down his mouth here. We've got the hierarchy of this shot as represented by the doctor who's inflicting this pain upon the child, who's then slumped, and then we've got the curvature of the spine there and the slooped pose, and then the drug itself being represented down the bottom here. Robinson is making a very strong argument here against the use of drugs, or the overuse of drugs on children, and we're meant to feel deeply sympathetic towards the child in this particular circumstance, looking at how vulnerable he is when placed in this circumstance and within this system. The next representation of authoritarian paradigms is shown through the embodiment of teachers. So we look at generally, and you can see like there's we presume this is male, 3 elderly male teachers with facial hair. I'm not quite sure about this guy, doesn't have any facial hair there as well. And then 1 female representation there, all using their fingers in some way, or hand gestures in some way. Here we get the physical assaulting of a child over here in this representation. We've got the use of the academic gown here and here with the hat as well. And then in all circumstances, we've got the hierarchy of positioning as well. So they're looking down upon children, they're looking over children, they're forcing children to obey and comply, and therefore repressing a child's autonomy of will. And finally, we have the representation of the paradigm in this mythological pose where we have, I think it's a cockatrice I believe, in that particular, or close to a cockatrice, as a myth. And this paradigm was represented again by the male figure with facial hair, glasses, this very dominant pose, holding up its particular virtues here, and symbols of representation. And then if we put ourselves in Robinson's camp, we position ourselves down here. This is the beast to overcome, and we are the champions to overcome it. We are the people who are able to and are morally obliged to overcome this stifling paradigm. So now we're going to get on to William Blake's The Garden of Love. This in the context of Romanticism, or the Romantic era in England. William Blake himself was a mystic, and he, I guess, claimed to have very personal interactions with the divine or the supernatural, and to be able to communicate and interact with the supernatural. He was highly critical of organized religion, and this was often the focus of a lot of his poetry. This particular poem was published in 1789 in Songs of Innocence and Experience. This was, the response to, or the antithesis of, another poem called The Echo in Green. And The Echo in Green is really that celebration of childhood freedom and how that corresponds with the human condition and the natural condition. There's a lot of use of biblical allusions in here. So while he's critical of organized religion, he's not, and the paradigm of and structures of organized religion, he's really he perceives and has a reading of scripture which is unique in his own, and is not. He would say that he's a Christian mystic. We can read this as a criticism of the church. And we see representations here of what looks like the Garden of Eden, where there is sexual and romantic freedom, and then the church imposing themselves and stifling those natural urges and those natural, parts of who we are. And we also see a representation of the church as almost a Gnostic view of the world, which needs to be constrained. So these priests are people who want to beat down or stifle the body, and the body is seen as the flesh, and to maximize their spiritual potential. Whereas this is definitely not how Blake sees this poem. It could also be seen as just the church being oppressive of free thought, and then there are parallels there with the incoming, and Blake was a part of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So he's seeing this happening, and he's being highly critical of the idea that that these people within power, within the Industrial Revolution, of which one is religion, are very constraining of free thinking. There's a beautiful lyrical simplicity to this poem. It echoes the style of a nursery rhyme, and masks this, funnily and deceptively, it masks the complex socio-political commentary and the philosophical commentary that provides a foundation for this piece, where he talks about the human condition. So the quick overview here is we can see the representations of childhood throughout this piece in the green there, and you can see that confluence between nature, childhood, uses this nostalgic voice to discuss what should be there, what was there, and what has now been usurped by the authoritarian religious authority. And then we look at the representations of this religious authority. It's prohibitive. We've got this idea that thou shalt not, this kind of ominous phrase, thou shalt not. We not even told exactly what we're not supposed to do here. It's just this general attitude of prohibition. and the chapel's shut, so it's exclusive. And then we have these death motifs moving through. So the nature and life are represented by childhood and freedom and joy and desire, whereas death, constriction, prohibition is represented, and in this kind of the juxtaposed idea of briars as opposed to more life-giving flora is represented here as well. So when we bring these texts together, we can see that there's some really beautiful confluence here between the messages of these texts, and fascinating that these texts actually sit either side, I guess in some ways, of the Industrial Revolution. Blake commenting at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and then Robinson commenting after the Industrial Revolution, and it's the residue of that paradigm and the way that it affects education. Both of them critical of the same particular movement. So the representation of children, though, is one which children are naturally very happy. They are joyful. They have very natural and wonderful desires that need to be celebrated rather than repressed, and that we've got the nature motif flowing through here as well. The slight difference we might see is that Robinson's focus is on creativity and unlocking that untapped potential of creativity, whereas Blake's is focused on, however you want to read it, sexuality or freedom of thought. And then when we look at the representation of these authoritarian paradigms, there's this really nice confluence here between the black gowns that the priests wear, and then we've got the black academic gowns here. These figures, the priests and a lot of the teachers, especially the teachers within the animation rather than the speech by RSA, are shown to be old, and they're shown to be prohibitive, they're shown to be stern, and they're shown to be aggressive in this way. So the representation, there's some confluence there between the two. Blake doesn't necessarily represent the priests as old, but he does represent them as being prohibitive and aggressive. There's this idea that they're binding, they attack the joys and desires through binding. And then there's the death motif here, which is really interesting. So the child here looks like he's dying based on his being drugged, and then based on being taught things from the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is, in essence, killing the child. And then we talk about the childhood itself being killed here from Blake's point of view with the death motif of tombstones and graves. And how they're actually destroying children. And here's my references.